Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you are listening to the sounds of film. On today's show, we are going to be exploring one of cinema's most overlooked mysteries. Why does film editing actually work? Joining us is acclaimed documentarian Chad Freidrichs, director of The Cinema Within, a groundbreaking new film that investigates how our brains process cuts, angles, and sequences to form seamless narratives. Featuring insights from legendary editors, film historians, and scientists, the documentary travels from Hollywood to a remote Turkish village to unravel the learned language of film. I want to thank Chad for joining us on the program, and this should be an interesting one. Chad, thanks so much for being on The Sounds of Film.
Thank you, Tom. I love that intro. Can I steal it?
Yeah, I love this movie. For anyone who is a film fan, I think they're going to love this film too. I feel like I went to film school watching this film, but it was very entertaining. How did you come up with the concept for this movie in the first place?
I used to teach filmmaking at the college level, and I would teach editing was my favorite class to teach. And um, it struck me one day that it's unusual that these edits that filmmakers use today have been around for 100 or so years. If you think about how much films have changed since, say the days of Charlie Chaplin or even before, they've changed quite a bit in many respects. They've added sound, of course, and color, and all sorts of CGI these days. The performance style has changed, but the basic language of film, how a film is constructed via edits, has remained largely the same, with a few exceptions. Most scenes are constructed today, and most scenes are shot in a somewhat similar way to the way they were 100 years ago. And so that struck me as something that may be profound. And so I kind of earmarked that as a potential topic for exploration. And then back in 2017, ultimately decided that I might pull the trigger on something like this. And so I started researching the psychology of film and film editing.
So that's interesting. So you said you used to be teaching. Um, why did you leave the teaching profession?
Well, I had an opportunity, shall we say. I had a mildly successful film that allowed me to pursue filmmaking full time.
So that's good. And where exactly are you located now today?
Today, I'm in Japan. My wife and I are here for the Osaka World's Fair. Our home base in America is in Missouri, but we travel to various locales for about 8 months out of the year. So we're what's called digital nomads. That obviously shapes certain kinds of films that I can create, documentary style. It's a little bit more difficult to do an observational style documentary. The kind of documentary that Cinema Within is in many ways a reflection of our lifestyle.
Okay, so you're a real expert on film. You love documentaries, and you've made them. So you want to get into editing, and your film raises some questions, which you kind of just introduced. Um, there's different people who are featured in this film who help you explore this question. Tell me about um, the different people who are in the film and what each person brought to your film in terms of how you were trying to answer this question.
Yeah, so just to clarify, so the basic question is why is it that editing works? Why does this kind of something that's so artificial in many ways, it's this kind of artificial assemblage of, hundreds or even thousands of film shots. Why does something like that feel natural to us? Because if you think about it, a film edit is something that's profoundly unnatural. You don't instantaneously jump across the room to a different perspective. That's something that doesn't happen in real life. And so, that was the question that kind of propelled me into it. In addition to why has this style been so long lasting, is why does this even work to begin with? And so, in pursuing that question, I started talking to psychologists and neuroscientists who study this actual question of the nature of film editing, looking into what it works and what it can explain about how we perceive in the real world. There's certain kinds of things that you can learn from this kind of aberration of film editing that applies to how we go about our daily lives. And so, those are the people that I talked to first. And so there's a handful of psychologists and neuroscientists in the film who explain their research and look into it. And their approach to film editing is that it's a deeply natural kind of thing, in the sense that it's not something that we would have to learn. I think with most kinds of things that we approach artifacts, we usually have to kind of learn how to do them in order to do them well. But with something like watching a film, it's something that is so immediate and intuitive that it feels like, even as children, that we don't really have to learn the rules of the basic film grammar, that how these two shots relate to each other. Say a person looking off screen, cut to a shot of a car, we understand immediately that the person is looking at that car. We understand immediately that those two people are in the same place at the same time. Well, we wouldn't have to interpret it that way, but that's how we tend to. And so that may tell us something about how the human mind works. And so that's why they study it. Additionally, I've always been a huge fan of David Bordwell, his work. He's was a scholar, recently passed away. And he was one of the most profound scholars on the form of cinema and how that maybe even relates to certain aspects of our psychological experience. Additionally, we interviewed Walter Murch, who he's a very famous film editor, edited Apocalypse Now, The Conversation, and he has a very famous text on film editing called In the Blink of an Eye, which kind of delves into, again, certain features of film editing that might be perceived as natural and how they may correspond to why we blink at certain times. So it's kind of range of people. And then finally, we have in the film, and it's kind of the main storyline of the film, a researcher who kind of tested this idea of the naturalness of film editing. If film editing is something that we can kind of immediately perceive and understand, then it should be the case that people who have never seen films before would be able to understand it. That would be maybe the best test of that question. And so her name was Sermin Ilderar. She went out and she found people in about 2007 that had never seen films before, located in a rural region of Turkey. And Sermin had created a series of experimental two-shot films that exemplified the basic film edits that have been used for 100 years, and showed them to this group of people who had never seen films before and asked them what they saw. And the question was, would they understand it or not?
Yeah, that was particularly interesting. And I don't want to give away the whole film, but she does discover that it's not something that one can take for granted, that if one never saw a movie, that they're able to understand it initially with her study. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, these it's a really unique facet of the film, I think. And when I discovered Sermon's work, I was enthused. And when I discovered that Sermon had actually recorded many of her experiments with video, I was even more enthused, because I'm, by nature, a kind of archival documentary filmmaker, I think. And so the fact that there was an archival record of these experiments was fascinating. And so the idea of being able to put people in my film who had never seen films before and watch them watch movies for the first time. Can you imagine? It's like jumping back, 100
Yeah.
years and watching the very first film viewers as they're trying to kind of navigate this new art form. Well, this art form was new to them. And so, yeah, the short films that Sermon created, let me give you kind of an example of what some of these experiments or the clips that she created look like. So there's a shot of, say, a woman looking down. It's just a shot of a woman looking down, cut to a single shot of shoes on the ground, right? And you and I, Tom, would immediately understand this as, oh, that woman is looking at those shoes, right?
Hmm.
And the question is, of course, do these people understand it that way? And there's another uh, shot of, or another clip of one gentleman looking left to right on screen, cut to another gentleman looking right to left on screen. And we would perceive those two people as looking at each other. Now, what I've just described is basically an eye line match with the first example, and this is a shot reverse shot. We also have what's called a match on action, where you have a shot that you have one shot of an action and then cut to another angle on that action, but the action is continuous over that shot. Those cuts, when used in films, are often invisible to people. They don't even perceptually see them. You know, the motion disguises the edit. So again, the question was, would they understand this? So she had this whole kind of battery of clips that are the kinds of clips called continuity edits, or the kinds of edits that are the kinds of edits that are by far the most common edits in cinema today and have been for 100 years. And yes, their response was checkered. They didn't understand every one of these clips. And the real question then becomes, what can that pattern of their understanding and misunderstanding tell us about what's natural and what's unnatural about these cuts? And also, what does that reveal about the way that we process the real world? And that's what some of these psychologists get into in the film.
It's so fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about the section related to the editor of The Conversation in Apocalypse Now. Um,
Mhm.
he really gets into this um, really keen observation about blinking. Can you
Mhm.
share with our listeners a little bit about what you learned about the human process of blinking and how it relates to film editing?
Yeah, it's surprisingly strange. So I learned a lot about blinking in this film, not only from Walter Murch, who is the film editor that you referred to, and who wrote a very famous book called In the Blink of an Eye, about this experience that we illustrate in the film, but also from a blink researcher named Tamami Nakano here in Japan. And you know, the how we often synchronize our blinks while watching a film, which indicates that the film itself is in some ways controlling where we blink. So what that suggests is that there's something very deep going on with blinks. But to go back to Walter Murch's experience, um, so I should state first off that so his book In the Blink of an Eye is based on an audio lecture that he did in Australia in the late 1980s. And we were able to locate the original recording of that lecture. And so that acts as the basis of Murch's story that he recounts in both present tense through an interview, but also through this old archival recording. So film geeks like myself, like being able to hear the original
Mm.
origin of In the Blink of an Eye is a treat. But basically what happened was Walter Murch, The Conversation, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, was from about 1973 or so. Coppola made the film between Godfather 1 and Godfather 2. And Murch, who was Coppola's sound designer on Coppola's prior films, assigned Murch the task of editing The Conversation, in part because Murch was a sound designer and The Conversation is about a sound surveillance expert. And so Coppola felt that Murch would be appropriately attuned to the sounds of the the sounds of the narrative in the conversation, and as well as Walter was already a pretty gifted editor, hopefully could tell. And so, but this was Walter Murch's first editing project, and so something that I think some of your listeners may not realize is the way that films are shot. Typically, a film isn't shot where what it's like what you see in a movie where you show a little bit of a
Hmm.
clip and then you show another angle and then you show another angle. Films aren't shot like that. What you typically do is you shoot the entirety of a scene from one angle, usually a wide angle first, and then you do 3 or 4 takes of that, and the director likes one of the takes, and then you move on to the next angle, you reset the lights, and then you move into a closer shot, and you shoot the entire scene from that closer shot, right? And then what the editor does in post-production is they take those very long takes of entire scenes and they will cut them down and decide when to cut from one point to another, right? So it's really a kind of decision process about the timing and the location that you're cutting to. And so Walter Murch, when he was editing the conversation, as he's watching Gene Hackman, he's you have to picture him. He's editing on this wonderful old flatbed editor.
Yeah.
So these are just big, awesome machine with big chunky buttons that you press to start and stop the playback. And so Walter Murch is watching Gene Hackman on screen, and he has to decide when is it that he wants to cut to the next shot. When should I end this shot and begin the next? And so he's just watching Gene Hackman do his thing, and then at a certain point he hits stop, right? And then marks the film at that point and says, okay, this is the point at which I initially felt that I should cut to the next shot. In order to confirm that, what he did was he would rewind the tape and go ahead and play the shot again and kind of feel the same thing and then hit the stop button, right? And what he started, first of all, what he noticed was that he was pretty consistent in the point at which he selected that cut. In other words, the second time through, he would always land very close to where he made a mark
Mm.
on the film from the first time through. But then the second thing he noticed, which is kind of strange, was that his edit points usually tended to land pretty close to the point where Gene Hackman was blinking. And it happened often enough where it started to raise a kind of question about why is it that this pattern is kind of developing? I mean, Murch has a very kind of scientific mind, and so he's going to detect this pattern pretty quickly. And so that leads him on a quest through an insight of a film director named John Huston, who Murch read an article where John Huston was being interviewed, and he talked about uh, the blink being similar to an edit. John Huston, while talking to the interviewer, used an example. He said, look at me, and now look over at the lamp. And this is something that I would encourage your listeners to do. It's really awesome. So try this with somebody else.
Yeah.
Have them look at you, and then have them look at some other object across the room, and then have them look back at you. Just instruct them to do this. But like watch their eyes while they do this. What you'll tend to see is that as they turn their head, they tend to blink, right?
Yeah.
And Huston equated that blink with a film edit. What your eyes do whenever they blink is they close, of course. So you have no incoming information. And so you have this almost cut of reality that takes place, where you cut out certain information as your eyes are moving. And your experience of it is basically, instead of it being kind of like a pan, your experience of it is basically like a cut from one object to another, from the person that you're talking to the lamp over there in the corner, and then back to the person. So our perceptual reality, according to Huston and thus Murch, is that it is full of these kinds of edits of visual experience. And so then Murch takes that idea and builds upon that initial insight, which also ties in this researcher in Japan as she kind of starts to notice that people are blinking in sync while watching film. So it gets pretty kind of heady there for a while, where you start to really kind of notice how much you're blinking and the points at which you blink.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember the exact statistic, but somebody says in the film, and you could tell me who said it, and the amount that were just blinking every few seconds, and that when you add it all up, we're blinking for a huge part of our day.
Yeah.
I've always heard how, like, when you're watching a movie, at least old films, that half the time you're watching it, because of the shutter opening and closing, you're looking at a like a black screen. Always heard that, but I never heard this about us blinking. On top of that,
Yeah.
so what is the amount that we're blinking all the time in general?
Well, so the real mystery of blinking, according to this blink researcher, and she would know, is that so most people think that we blink to lubricate our eyes, right? So the idea is that, and it's a very good reason evolutionarily why we would want to do that. Our eyes are exposed to the air, they dry out, and so you blink to lubricate them, right? You take the optic fluid and put it over the eye. But what we actually blink about 5 times more than we need to blink in order to lubricate our eyes. So the question is, why do we blink so much? Other animals don't do that. Other animals usually tend to blink about what they need to. And her research actually shows, it's not in the film, but I think this is a very interesting fact. Her research shows that the more social the animal is, the more it blinks,
Hmm.
right? So, a lizard may blink about what it needs to lubricate its eye. But say an ape is blinking almost equivalent to the amount that a human is blinking, and the timing of those blinks is very significant. And so that's what the film gets into. But in terms of like how much, so you have to remember. So one of the cool things about like Zoom that I've noticed, or any sort of like online kind of conversation app, is that you can watch yourself, and there's a subtle delay, and so you can actually see yourself blink, which you never do, because if you look in the mirror, you obviously can't see yourself blink because
Yeah,
your eyes are closed, right?
right.
But it doesn't feel that way. Like we have these blinks all the time. We have, I think it's about 20 blinks per second. And yet when you blink, notice this, when you blink, go ahead and blink right now, you'll notice that you can't see darkness. You don't see anything, right? Your visual system blocks out that darkness. Um, so it's an interesting question as to what exactly is being filled in, and I can get into that if you want.
Yeah.
But basically, between blinks, I'll go there in just a second, but between blinks and subtle eye movements that we have, which are called saccades, that is, your eye is constantly moving around. You don't even realize it because it looks like you're just kind of looking at a scene and it's just kind of sitting there static. But watch somebody whenever they're looking at things. What you'll notice if you look real close is that the eye is constantly moving around. And so that image that you're seeing is actually being stabilized by your eye, and a kind of composite image is actually created by your mind, that only is accessible in your head as you're experiencing it. But it's nothing like what your eyes are actually doing. That stable image that you see is created by a bunch of eye movements, moving around, darting around constantly, assembling this very static shot. And also, with each of those eye movements, whenever your eye is rapidly moving like that, it's very blurry. It's like lens blur. Like if you're if you do what's called a whip pan with the camera,
Mm.
it'll blur, right? So you got this blur constantly intruding upon your eyesight, and of course we don't experience that as well. So your visual system is constantly editing out both the darkness that comes from a blink and the blurriness that comes from a saccade as it's moving around. And a psychologist in the film named Jeff Sachs, he quotes one of his colleagues who says, who determined, added up all the time that we're blinking and saccading, and came to the conclusion that we are perceptually blind. That is, we are unaware of visual information for about a third of our waking lives.
Oh my goodness. Plus, when you add to it how long we sleep each day too.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
it's just crazy. Um, you were describing before that, like, when we turn our head,
Yeah.
it's kind of like a camera panning, but that we're not
Mm-hmm.
actually seeing everything, because we're blinking throughout the process. And
Mm-hmm.
that's just fascinating. And I was kind of curious why there seems to be, like, if you're a movie fan, people love when a director will try to do like a long scene without any cuts, like
Mm,
Goodfellas, going through the Copa or something like that with one long take. Um, because even in real life, we're not quite doing that. I've learned from watching your movie. Do you have any theories as
mhm.
to like why sometimes people love? Is it just a film geek kind of thing, just because it's different, or is there something to
Well,
that?
I think the thing that you have to remember is that even though, so like, let's say we're walking through the Copacabana, right?
Right.
If you and I were to walk through the Copacabana, we would experience walking through that um, Copacabana much like it's portrayed in Goodfellas, right? We
Hmm.
would experience it as a continuous flow of images. They don't necessarily change perspective. And so, those shots in some way do correspond to the way we actually experience our visual perception, even if it's composed of these kind of fragmented images. Um, I think also there's just the fact that filmmakers, like to show off and they like to kind of, make entire films sometimes.
Yeah.
I think that's a show of kind of bravado where you don't have any kind of edits. And it's a good kind of test of one's ability to discern whether a scene is working or not and to make the adjustments and all the technical things that have to go on. So I think, it's almost a technical challenge that filmmakers take upon themselves. But, that experience of a single camera walking through a space, it actually corresponds very closely to our visual experience. The real surprising thing, given that we don't notice um, all of these disruptions in our vision, is how exactly we can process a very disrupted film in such an easy and intuitive way.
And what did you learn about that? I mean, you speak to neuroscientists. Um, what is the reason that we do process information in this way with these cuts?
Well, so I think first of all, you should I should clarify the kinds of cuts that we're talking about. So these are the films or the edits that are analyzed in the cinema within are what are called the continuity edits, which is part of an overall system that was developed by Hollywood, or at least put together in Hollywood in the 1910s and subsequently spread worldwide, was imitated very quickly and spread throughout the world and is still the style that we use today. So the kinds of edits that we're talking about here are very kind of mainstream, formalized edits, and basically like 99% of the scenes of films and television that you watch are composed of, basically 5 or 6 different kinds of these edits. And so one idea about how they work is that they are attuned to our natural perception. That is, that the early filmmakers, when they were developing this back in the 1900s, early 1900s, were working on trial and error, right? So they were just kind of, you know, they would make an edit and then they would kind of see how that works, right? So for instance, I've seen films like this. Well, let's say that you want to cut from a wide shot to a closer shot, right? There's and you want to have action in that shot. Now, there's multiple ways you could do this. You could show the action twice, right? So you could show the person setting the glass down on the table in the wide shot, and then you cut into the close up right, as they're about to do it again, and then they do it again. That was an actual strategy that was tried, where you'd actually see the action twice, right? Or you could cut out the action entirely. You could just do what might be called a jump cut, where you have the person setting down the glass in the wide shot, and then you just cut in the glasses on the table. That would feel really, really disjunctive, right? Probably the first one would too, where you see it twice. What filmmakers gradually discovered is the best way to do this, or the way that feels most natural, is to cut in the midst of the motion, so that shot A, the action isn't completed, and in shot B, the action has already started, so that the motion of the action that's taking place kind of disguises the edit. It feels smooth. It feels realistic. So much so that people don't even notice these kinds of edits most of the time. Even if you ask them to detect edits, they won't even notice these kinds of edits. So this is the kind of filmmaking that has been the norm. There's another kind of edit called an eyeline match
Hmm.
that works. So going back to the match in action, though, one of the reasons why these psychologists feel that this edit works is because it tricks our motion sensor system. There's something in our brain that detects that motion. If that motion is kind of going roughly in the same direction between the two shots, then it's going to naturally knit those two things together, right? So there's something about that motion that takes place on the edit that is exploiting a certain feature of our cognitive apparatus, of the way that we understand the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Another kind of edit, what's called a match in action, this would be this is known as an eyeline match. This is the example here is the woman looking down, cut to her shoes. This works because, so psychologists assume, because when we're looking at somebody in real life, right? Just say somebody is just like really intently looking at something in your real life, or even pointing at something, right? You have this kind of real deep urge to want to look at what they're looking at,
Mm.
right? There's something really profound in you that wants to understand why they find that so interesting. And so you're going to look at that other thing. And so it's perfectly natural for us to go from somebody looking at something to the object of their gaze, right? And so that, kind of fundamental feature of us that seems very hardwired into us, being very social animals, is a very reasonable and plausible explanation as to why an eyeline match feels so natural to us and why it works and why it doesn't appear to require any sort of learning. So these are the kinds of things that Sermon Ilderar, when she went out to Turkey to show these first-time viewers for the first time, that's what she's testing, is that kind of innateness of our understanding of editing. How quickly can we understand it? Is it something that needs to be learned, or is it something that we can pretty much get right away?
And what is it? I mean, is there uh, is it something that has to be learned? Does having exposure make one more sophisticated in one's understanding of these things, or is it innate?
Well, that's a great question, Tom, and that's precisely the point of the film.
Right.
And so I think
Exactly.
I might give away too much.
Yeah.
I will say that there are there are certainly some difficulties that the first-time viewers encounter with understanding certain kinds of edits,
Yeah.
but the pattern is what really matters. The pattern of understanding and not understanding. Why do they understand certain cuts and not other cuts? And that's what ultimately the narrative of the film is about. When I started this film, I really wanted to make a film that made edits and editing, especially these kind of foundational continuity edits, into the kind of driver of the drama of the film. To make something where the process of editing or the process of experiencing edits really contributes to, are they going to understand it or not? And so Ilderar's research really made for a good kind of narrative premise on which to kind of hang a little drama
Yeah.
based on this kind of mystery and curiosity as to whether they're going to understand or not.
So you have to watch the film to find out. I'm curious.
Yeah.
I worked with first-time filmmakers, or making films on video and stuff like that. I was a film teacher as well, and I was always amazed with young kids how some people could come right into it like day one and just
Mm.
have it seem like this ability to shoot something properly and edit it using a lot of the techniques that you described. And other
Mhm.
people, I mean, it was just a mess, and they really had to be taught how to put it all together and how to shoot it. And this film got me wondering a little bit about not only, does someone have to be educated to be able to understand it, but I'm also curious about, like,
Mm.
filmmakers themselves. You hear of people like Quentin Tarantino, who claims, like, he didn't go to film school, but he watched a ton of movies and he learned how to do it that way,
Mhm.
before he made them. Do you have any theories as to how filmmakers and film editors learn their craft?
No, it's a really interesting question, and it really kind of gets in a way to the kind of heart of the question of the film, because how did those first-time filmmakers arrive at these kind of intuitions outside of just trial and error? And you know, they I don't think they did. I think they arrived at it through trial and error. And so, yes, I think you're right. I've taught many students as well in editing, and some seem to kind of grasp it intuitively right away. Others, require kind of more explicit work to get them there. But I do think that for the ones that are very sensitive to how a film is impacting them, I think that that's maybe what you're describing, as well as maybe have done their own research. Those kind of students usually are the ones that can kind of pick the stuff up pretty quickly, because they're asking themselves, how is this going to work for an audience member? Does this feel right to me in some way? And there's a certain sense in which something feeling right just means kind of how much it corresponds to the hundreds or thousands of films that they've watched over the course of their life up to that point. And in a certain sense, we have been trained on this style by this point. But I do think that if you take somebody who the rules haven't been explicitly explained, and maybe hasn't watched tons and tons of film kind of analytically, but just kind of watches them in the way that most people watch movies, just kind of experience them. I do think that most people, if they're being kind of sensitive about it, if they pick up editing, I think that they would arrive a lot of these techniques on their own. I remember when I edited my very first film. I didn't even want to edit it. It's not something that interested me before I knew what it was all about. It sounded boring and technical. But when I started doing it, I still remember today, like the first time I made accidentally, I did it completely accidentally. I made a match action cut, one of these cuts where the action continues,
Yeah, yeah.
flows from one shot to another. And I remember just like looking at that and thinking, wow, it just feels so real.
Yeah,
It just feels like a movie. I just made a movie.
right.
It really makes you feel incredible. And I tell you, I mean, it's not the same, but I still feel that way whenever I make a max action edit, even today.
Yeah.
There's something in it that is just so perfect. It just works so well, and the illusion is so complete that it just adds a charge to your experience very briefly. But it's just like you smile, like, yeah, still working. So I think a lot of these with, eyeline match and maybe even cross cutting. It
Hmm.
took a while for cross cutting to develop. That is cutting between two parallel lines of action. You often see this in the ends of films as a kind of big suspense where, Luke's fighting on the Death Star with Darth Vader with his lightsaber, and but you also have down on Endor, you've got the Ewoks trying to get into the base to deactivate the shields, but then you've also got the spaceships on the outside all fighting. You're cutting between all three of these, and you leave them off at a kind of suspenseful moment. Whether or not they discover that, that's a pretty, I'm not sure. But I think the more basic ones, I think people would just discover just by doing it, just because it does kind of work. And I think just over time, you would discover that it works, and you would feel it.
You said that it's still exciting for you to make certain edits. When you're just watching movies as a fan these days, is there anything that excites you in terms of editing when you're just watching a film these days? Like, what gets you excited? Now that you've seen like a million films at this point and studied editing.
Oh, I mean, there's so many times where I'll just like be like, wow, that was a really great cut. There's either a hard cut or something that just kind of you could see it like kind of disguise something or fix something, but it was a very clever kind of tactical choice on that. So I notice those kinds of things sometimes. I love a documentary that makes an associative edit where you basically associate two different things
Mm,
together. What might be called montage, the creation of an idea by juxtaposing two different shots. All those things I still notice and enjoy. Like most viewers, though, most of the time I'm trying to turn that off and just focus on the plot and make sure I know what's going on and who the characters are, etc. But every now and again, you'll just notice particular instances. I don't think there's any categories that probably I haven't seen. in my career thus far, and so there's nothing that's going to be too terribly novel in editing, but just individual instances of very either refined editing, or sometimes it's just an individual edit where I'll notice it and be like, wow, that was a nice cut.
How do you feel if you watch something like avant-garde that's like purposely just
Mm.
breaking all the rules of normal editing? That can be
Well,
disjarring for people if they go to a museum, but it's, some people will say it's fantastic. What are your
yeah, well, I mean, I like it just fine. So like in the narrative film context, you can think back to say Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless, big breakthrough film, and that was a one of the reasons why it's considered a breakthrough is because he violated intentionally these continuity rules that had been around at that point for about 60 years,
hmm
or I guess maybe 50 years at that point. So he did what were called jump cuts. And this is where you violate something called the 30-degree rule, which is a very technical kind of sounding thing. But basically, a character, you just cut out certain parts of a shot, and all of a sudden the character jumps on screen. So, kind of like my example earlier, if you
Yeah.
have somebody setting down a glass on a table, if you cut from their before their hand moves and you just cut to the glass on the table, that would be a jump cut, and it would feel very jarring. Well, Godard did this on purpose, right? He did it for a couple of reasons, but one of the ways that people appreciated it was the idea that this reflects the kind of jumpy, chaotic nature of these characters' lives, right? And so it was a kind of artful use of a violation of these continuity editing rules. Nowadays, you see that all the time in fiction films where they adopt this kind of discontinuous editing, that is
hmm
something that's opposite of the classical continuity rules. This will often be adopted in by editors in times of like chaos, right? So a battle scene, you'll see a lot of jump cuts where the jumping becomes very explicit, right? You notice it. In fact, this is what got me to be a filmmaker. Actually, I there's a film called JFK,
Yeah.
directed by Oliver Stone, and the editing of that film at times, oftentimes in that film, it's very smooth and classical and continuous. But there are other times in the film where the editing can't be ignored. You have to notice it,
hmm
right? It just calls attention to itself. It's going from black and white to color. Well, that's going to be you're going to notice that right away, right? And it's doing all these jump cuts and jumping around in space and time and constructing this kind of plot. Well, you know, I don't think it's an accident. I watched that when I was maybe 14 years old, and I don't think it's an accident that that movie made me want to be a filmmaker
Yeah.
because it was the first time that I ever noticed that there was somebody making the film. You can actually see the construction of the film. You can see its seams. And so it's no surprise that that acts as an inspiration for a filmmaker because all of a sudden you think about other people making films and maybe I can do that too.
Yeah.
And so that was my film, and that made me want to be a filmmaker. And so I think it's appropriate that ultimately it all comes full circle in a way to where now I'm making movies about editing, and what drew me in initially was very explicit, very jump cutty editing. So yeah, that kind of editing style where it is kind of jarring is often used for very creative purposes, obviously in art spaces where people are it's just a rapid succession of seemingly disrelated images, and it kind of bombards you with an assault of images, and those are cool too, up to a point for me. After a certain point I maybe become a little bit motion sick, or becomes overwhelming. But
Right.
within the context of a narrative film, that's a very common strategy these days. It's modern cinema is all about using whatever kinds of resources that you can to kind of evoke a certain feel or emotion, and those kinds of um, assaultive kinds of montages are very appropriate for that.
Absolutely. And do you have a favorite edit from this film that you just made?
Oh man, I haven't thought about that. I have to watch it again. No, I can't recall. I wish I could. It's a great question, but I'm not. I don't have that great a memory, I think.
Well, I do want to compliment you though, because this film just blew me away. Uh, it's on one hand, you know, teaching people about all these different editing techniques that you were talking about today, but then you bring in all these different people from different areas and you tell a story. And there's great clips from lots of different films that people will recognize. I mean, it's just a very entertaining, thoughtful film. And I think for a film fan, it's just going to blow them away. Um, nice work, Chad. Really, really impressive.
Well, thank you very much. I always knew when this is always a kind of red flag that I had that if you're making a film about editing, people are going to pay attention to your editing in the film, and so it's going to come under extra scrutiny. So I try my best to make it all blend together in a coherent way.
Well, you definitely did it. Now, if people want to see this film, can you direct them to where they're able to watch it?
Yeah, it's just on your usual streaming sources. Our website is cinemawithin.com. Then that points you to there's a trailer on there so people can kind of get a sense of the treatment of the subject. But there's links to the various places where it's streaming. It's on Canopy. If people have that through their public libraries, they can screen it for free. Or like Apple TV and Amazon, all those kind of usual streaming options. It's available. If you just Google it, it'll be there.
Well, Chad, I want to thank you so much for coming on the program. Everyone go see this film. You're going to love it. And hopefully we can talk again in the future.
That sounds wonderful, Tom. I really had a great time. Thank you.
Thank you.